A literature teacher mentors a student to help improve his writing. However, when the teen chooses his friend's family as the story's subject and spends time in their house for information, the teacher worries if he may have pushed the student too far. On the first day of school, Anouk, the office secretary, welcomes teacher Germain back from summer vacation. That afternoon, Germain's wife, Jeanne, returns to their apartment after attending her employer Bruno's funeral. She complains that the late gallery owner's twin sisters wish to meet with her tomorrow to discuss the establishment's future. Meanwhile, the husband is busy grading his students' writing exercise and laments over their poor work. However, an essay written by Claude Garcia catches his eye, so he reads it aloud. In the essay, the teen recounts how he spent his Saturday in his classmate Rafa's house. He admits that during the summer, he sat on the bench in front of the house and observed the family. When he saw that Rafa failed his math test, he grabbed the opportunity and offered to tutor his classmate. In Rafa's home, Claude says he gave the students some trigonometry problems to solve, then went downstairs to snoop. There, he saw his classmate's mother and noted the woman's captivating scent. After Germain reads the story, he and his wife are intrigued. The next day, the teacher speaks to Claude after class and admonishes him for writing about his friend. When the student asks if he's let anyone else read the story, Germain lies, but says he could show the principal. Claude clarifies that he wrote it for the teacher and no one else. He adds that since he's good at math, he's decided to improve his writing. Germain asks him how Rafa would feel if he found out his friend wrote borderline inappropriate things about his mother, so he discourages the student from writing about his friend's family. Before the teen leaves, he hands the next writing assignment to the teacher. In the next chapter of the story, the teen recounts how he told Rafa that they should study in his house again that evening. Then, he explains that he chose the affable student because he often saw Rafa's parents pick him up after school last year. Since then, he's wondered what a perfect family's house looks like from the inside. That afternoon, Germain visits the art gallery where Jeanne works, and she asks for his opinion regarding the provocative artwork on display. She expresses her concern that the twins, who now own the establishment, might close it down if she's unable to prove that it's a viable business. Moments later, she asks him how his day went, and he says Claude submitted the second chapter. As the story continues, he and Rafa finally arrive at the house, where the guest sees Esther, the mother, holding a magazine and tape measure by the window. She greets the teens with kisses on the cheek and is delighted when she finds out Rafa got a B on his math test thanks to his friend. After she tells the teens to help themselves with snacks in the kitchen, she heads back to the window to continue measuring. Claude notes how the woman's dress shows off her curves. In the art gallery, Jeanne says she feels uncomfortable reading the teens' writing. She thinks Germain should inform either the principal or Claude's parents. The next morning, the teacher asks Anouk for the student's file, and he learns that his mother abandoned him, while his father is unemployed due to a disability. Later that day, Germain and the teen end their tutoring session with the man lending him books to read. In exchange, Claude hands him the next chapter. In the story, Rafa Sr., his friend's father, interrupts the teens to ask them if they'd like to watch a basketball game on TV later. Claude describes how he thinks the older man lathers up in the shower and remarks on how different he looks when he isn't wearing sweats. That evening, while watching the game, Rafa Sr. mentions how the opposing team has a Korean player and shares how the Chinese people he's met feel about Koreans. The teen says the man spent a few days in China years ago, but somehow considers himself an expert on the country's culture. Shortly after, Rafa Sr.'s boss, Maurice, calls to tell him to pick up their client Wang Li from the airport. The next day, Germain tells the student that the last chapter reads like a parody, especially the way he describes the father. So, the teacher tells him to learn how to write his characters in a way that doesn't come off as judgmental. Before he leaves, Claude asks why Germain is helping him out of all the students, and the man says it's because he writes well and deserves the motivation. In the new version of the latest chapter, the teen recounts the events in a more realistic but dry manner, making sure not to describe any of the characters or their actions in a demeaning way. However, when Jeanne reads it, she thinks the student wrote that way on purpose, with thinly veiled snark and condescension as a way to teach Germain a lesson. On their next session, the man admonishes the teen for continuing to write the characters as caricatures. To help him out, he lends him more books to read. That afternoon, Jeanne asks for her husband's opinion regarding art pieces she plans to include in the gallery opening. When he says he doesn't understand most of them, she exasperatedly exclaims that she needs to find worthy pieces before the opening in 3 weeks. To take her mind off her stressful job, the man hands her Claude's newest chapter. In the story, the teen eavesdrops on Rafa Sr. and Esther's conversation. The husband suggests they use their savings and a small loan to work directly with Wang Li to produce Barbie-like dolls, so he doesn't have to work for Maurice. However, the woman says they already discussed they'd use part of their savings on house renovations, and she annoyedly walks away. Upstairs, Claude pretends he's admiring the artwork on the wall, and when the woman sees him, says he needs to head home soon because it's getting dark. Later, the student listens in on the couple's conversation in the bedroom. Esther thinks Rafa needs a real tutor because she doesn't like Claude hanging around the house. After Jean reads the chapter, she says the student reminds her of her cousin who always had the family dirt during reunions. When she kisses her husband, clearly initiating intimacy, the man doesn't pick up on her cues. The next day, Germain points out that his student's story lacks conflict, a major factor readers need to fully invest in written work. Before he leaves, Claude shares that he might not be able to continue writing because they have a math test on Thursday. If Rafa fails, his mother will have to get a real tutor, and he'll never be back in the house. The teen implies that the teacher could steal the test if he really wants Claude to keep writing. Germain says he can just use his imagination when writing about the family, but the student insists he needs to be inside the house for it to feel authentic. At lunch, the man tries to get Bernard, the math teacher, to divulge the contents of the upcoming test, to no avail. Later that day, Germain steals the test from Bernard's locker and photocopies it. Before the test, Claude shows Rafa the copy with answers on it, to the friend's delight. In the next chapter, Rafa eagerly shows his test results to his parents, and Esther, in particular, is thankful to Claude for his help. Then, the father and son invite the student to play basketball with them on Saturday. Claude declines, but notes the disappointed look on his friend's face. As he's about to leave, Rafa asks if Germain gave him the test. When the teen feigns ignorance, the friend warns him about the teacher because he's heard that his wife owns an adult store in town. After reading the chapter, Jean asks why she and her husband are now part of the story. She asks if the part about Germain stealing the test was true and admonishes the man when he doesn't deny the allegation. He says he had to do it so his student keeps tutoring Rafa. On Saturday, the teen waits for the father and son to leave for their basketball game before ringing the doorbell and telling Esther that he's there to retrieve a book. However, Claude knows it isn't there because it's in his house. The student compliments the woman's earrings and says his mother had a pair just like them. When he mentions that his mother left when he was 9, he's aware that it'll elicit sympathy from Esther. Then, she takes him to the kitchen for a drink, and they talk about the artwork in the hallway. Claude knows he needs to leave before the father and son return, because they might not take too kindly to him spending time alone with the woman. After reading, Jean worries the student's increasingly bold behavior might get him in trouble with Rafa and his father. However, Germain believes the teen's just making his stories up. During the next tutoring session, Claude keeps Rafa busy with math problems so he can snoop in the couple's bedroom. There, he finds an x-ray of the woman's spine as well as anti-anxiety medication. Suddenly, the couple returns and the teen eavesdrops on their conversation in the kitchen. The man shares an update on his problems with Maurice at work. With the latest chapter, Jean concludes that Esther isn't doing well because she feels neglected, since her husband prioritizes his job. The next day, Germain points out that Esther takes up too much of the student's story. Claude explains that his character desires the woman, and Rafa and his father are now the sources of conflict. The teacher says that the teen still doesn't know if he's writing a middle-class satire, a parody, or a coming-of-age story. Before they end the session, the man tells him to stop mocking Esther, who's old enough to be his mother. Later that day, twins Rosalie and Eugenie head to the gallery, where Jean shows them a collection from a Chinese artist. When she gets home, she finds her husband reading the latest installment in Claude's story. The teen joins the family celebratory dinner for Rafa's high test score. He mentions Germain, and Esther says her son told her the teacher always seemed bitter. Claude says the man is bitter because he wants to write for a living, but lacks the talent. As Jean reads the line, she asks her husband if he isn't offended by what his student wrote, but Germain agrees with what Claude said. In the story, the student joins Rafa Sr. on the porch and says he and the man have more meaningful conversations compared to Rafa's conversations with his father. During the next session, Germain is glad they can use the teen's growing closeness with the father as a source of conflict with Rafa. He thinks the son growing jealous of Claude will bring much-needed character development. The teen asks if the teacher and his wife ever wanted kids, but the man says it's none of his business. In the next chapter, the student heads to the gym, and the father and son are delighted to see him. To elicit sympathy from Rafa Sr., he says he stopped playing basketball after his mother left. On Monday, Germain says the teen is too heavy-handed when painting a picture of how he plans to take Rafa's place in the family. He thinks he needs to let the readers fill in the blanks themselves to form their own conclusions. The student asks why the man never seriously pursued being a writer, so the teacher admits he tried a few years ago, but realized he wasn't very good at it. In class, Germain calls on Rafa to read aloud his essay on who he considers his best friend. While the teen stands in front of the class, the other students jeer and laugh at his essay about Claude. Then, the teacher tells him to write it down on the board so they can correct it. Embarrassed, Rafa tells his friend how mad he is at the teacher. So, Claude suggests he write an article in the school paper about the incident. The next day, the teacher apologizes to the student, but his friend thinks he should still push through with the plan and writes it himself. Days later, Germain reads the published article, which he believes Claude wrote, and is called into the principal's office. Exasperated, the teacher explains that he wasn't trying to embarrass the student and simply wanted to correct his work so the entire class could learn from it. The next day, Rafa Sr. speaks to Germain and admonishes him for embarrassing his son. That evening, at the gallery opening, the teacher is shocked when Esther and Rafa Sr. arrive. To avoid trouble, he excuses himself and leaves. That night, Jeanne expresses her disappointment that the twins never showed up at the gallery opening. When her husband would rather talk about why the couple was there that evening, the infuriated wife reminds him that she could lose her job if the twins sell the gallery. Hours later, Jeanne admits she sent the couple the invitation to the event because she thought he might like to see them in person. Germain says he doesn't because they're just characters in a story. Despondent, the woman asks if he thinks she's just a character as well, so the man assures her that she isn't and takes her in his arms. In the next chapter, Rafa Sr. tells Claude to stay for the night since there's a storm outside. As the teen prepares for bed, Rafa suddenly kisses him on the lips. Later, the student wanders the house, enters his friend's room, and watches him stir in his sleep. The next day, Claude says he included the kiss to flesh out Rafa's character, and because he thought Germain might like it. The teacher reminds him to write according to his own desires, and not what he thinks the teachers are. In the revision, Claude sneaks into the parents' room instead, where he imagines the couple making love. After reading the latest chapter, Jeanne asks her husband if he desires a student, since they stopped making love when he started mentoring him. The man explains that he simply sees that Claude has a gift and wishes to help him reach his full potential. On Saturday, the teen spends time with Esther by the porch. When she stands up, she touches her back and says she still feels pain despite getting surgery. As they move to the bench, he watches her face and admires her beautiful features. Days later, Claude listens to the couple argue after Esther learns Rafa Sr. took a client to a gentleman's club. After the man storms off to the porch, the teen sneaks into the living room to hand the woman a piece of paper. The next day, while he's alone with the woman in the kitchen, she thanks him for the poem he wrote her. Then, the teen imagines Germain entering the room to give him notes on his writing. However, despite the man's argument that starting an affair with Esther isn't the best way for the story to go, the teen kisses the woman. Unbeknownst to him, Rafa sees them from the hallway. Later, while Claude and the woman are in the living room, they hear a noise from upstairs. He goes to check and, to his surprise, finds Rafa lifelessly hanging from the ceiling. In his apartment, Germain is horrified when he finishes reading the chapter. The next day, he sees that Rafa isn't in his usual seat. Claude gives him an evil smile, so he rushes to Anouk's office to ask if Rafa's parents called to excuse his absence. The woman says no, so the teacher asks her to give them a call. After Anouk speaks to Esther, she says the students stayed home because of the flu. Relieved, Germain returns to the classroom, cancels the class, but tells Claude to stay behind. The student says he knew the teacher wouldn't like the ending, so he changed it. Germain thinks he's gone too far, and knows they'll both get in trouble if people read what he's written. The teen reveals that he almost quit school on the first day, but the writing assignment changed his mind. The teacher suggests he write about himself or his own family, but Claude says he likes the characters now, because the man taught him how. The student insists he won't stop writing, so Germain says he'll simply stop reading. Hurt, the teen crumples his latest chapter and throws it in the trash can. After he leaves, the teacher retrieves the paper. In his revised ending, Rafa Sr. comes home, tells his wife that he's had enough of his stressful job, and says he set his boss's car on fire. Seconds later, Esther reveals that she's with child, to the man's delight. Then, Rafa arrives and says he'd like a real tutor because he doesn't want to see Claude anymore. The next day, Germain finds the injured Claude on the basketball court after Rafa confronts him for kissing his mother. The teacher admits to reading the rest of his story, but says the happy ending doesn't work. However, the student says he's quit writing. Later, he waits by the bench next to the family's house, and Esther approaches him. He says he's there so they can run away together. However, the woman explains that what they had wasn't real and that he only fell in love with an image of her in his head. She says they really hurt her son and husband, and Claude says he never meant to hurt anybody. She says the family's moving to China to start a new life. The next day, after he helps his father out of bed and finishes preparing breakfast, Claude heads to the gallery. In school, the principal interrupts the class to call Germain and Rafa into his office. Meanwhile, the teen heads to the teacher's apartment, where Jean lets him in. Later, the man returns home, where his wife hands him Claude's last chapter. In the story, the student spots a book Germain wrote, and she says he can keep it. During lunch, Jean lets slip that she's read his work, and says that Esther never would have left Rafa Sr. despite the rough patch. Claude asks why she and Germain never had children, and she says they just never thought about it. However, the teen lies and says her husband said the reason why they never had children was because she was infertile. Suddenly, the phone rings, and the woman learns that the school suspended Germain because Rafa told the principal about the math test. As the teacher finishes reading the story, the last few lines cause him to believe that something might have happened between his wife and the student. He heads to the bedroom where Jeanne is packing her suitcase. She says she's leaving him because the gallery and their marriage are both failures. However, the man is convinced she slept with Claude. He pushes her down on the bed and threatens to strangle her. Fortunately, the woman hits him on the head with a heavy book. Days later, Claude joins a disheveled Germain on a park bench and says he liked the love story in the man's book. Then, as they observe the many apartments in the buildings in front of them, they begin making up stories about the colorful characters inhabiting each one.